starting with the county engineer.
There are no changes, Judge.
Flood control district.
Judge, while we're talking about it, Russ, would you come up and talk to us about page 7B1, tunnels? Obviously, I'm not opposed to big, bold visions, but Russ, just give us an idea of what we're talking about, what we're planning to spend on this design, this study.
Sure, Commissioner. Judge, Commissioners, Russ Poppe, Executive Director of Harris County Flood Control District. What we're proposing is basically to do a feasibility study to just look at the technology, the engineering, the soils that we have in Harris County to see if this is a technique that would even be feasible for us to consider as another proverbial tool in the toolbox. We're not going to go and start doing a tunnel project tomorrow. There's a lot of legwork that needs to get done in order to make sure that this is something that I can even recommend to the court members as something that's viable that we could use in maybe select instances. I don't want to create any false impression that this is going to be the cure-all, fix-all for the county, because until we do the feasibility study, which is highly dependent upon soil conditions underneath the ground, the technology may be there today or may take some time yet for the technology to catch up, but we won't know that unless we do the feasibility study. So we're looking to enter into negotiations with Frugro, who's a well-known geotechnical firm, because this is a geotechnical evaluation, to help us better identify whether or not this is going to be a solution that we could potentially pursue in the future.
I got you. I understand you have to negotiate, but what do you anticipate spending?
I think a couple $100,000 would probably get us a pretty good ways down the road to say with better certainty about whether or not we can use this technology or not.
All right. Well, and we all know, of course, that we've already got billions of dollars in unfunded core projects on the books currently, correct?
We do. That is correct.
Just a couple questions.
Sure.
So, Russ, so at most, a couple 100,000, maybe no more than 4 at most.
Yes, Commissioner. And we'll come back in front of Commissioners Court with the agreement when it's prepared.
And that would come from us, or can it be refunded by FEMA or anybody? Is that?
We are prepared to fund this locally out of the flood control funding at this time. And if it turns out to be something that's feasible that we want to pursue, then absolutely I think we'll be looking at other federal or partnerships to help fund it.
And I saw the speculation in the press, which was pretty high in terms of dollar amount.
Yeah.
But that would be well down the road, because that's a pretty good wish list if the figures were as high as the ones I saw in the press.
That's correct. But the impression is, though, that if these tunnels are indeed feasible and they can carry large amounts of water, well, then the analogy would be, well, if I don't do a tunnel, well, then what would it cost in terms of right-of-way acquisition and construction to do a traditional approach and widening one of our bayous? And so that's what we hope to figure out as part of the study.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Poppe, have these tunnels been used in other countries? The reason I ask is tomorrow I'm going to Boston to be part of an international summit on resilience. Is there anybody I ought to ask about this?
They did the big dig in Boston, which was...
No, we don't want to talk about the big dig in Boston. I've already mentioned that one to you.
Yes, you have. Well, Austin has recently done one.
No, I mean other countries.
Countries?
This is
Yes.
an international group.
That's correct. And so Europe has done a lot of these, primarily for transportation purposes, but obviously we'd be looking for stormwater management purposes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Russ.
Anything else on flood control? Toll Road Authority, budget management.
Judge, I'd like to bring your attention to item L under budget management. We've been working with John Blunt, county engineer, and Russ Poppe at flood control, and we're coming to a point in time where we need to start having the discussion about the flood control and how we would finance this. One of the things, when the federal government has matches, provides funding, they require local matches. And so what I'd like to do is have Russ talk a little bit about what some of the needs are, and then I'll follow up with some additional information on the funding.
That's right. So the emergency supplemental package, the third package, got passed in February. I think it's called the Bipartisan Budget Act. But in that was $89 million to fund various different federal programs, of which we could stand to benefit from.
Billion.
Billion, sorry. Billion, that's important. Thank you for the correction. But we, like other department heads, are trying to position ourselves to make the most of those opportunities. And while the guidance is still being written by the various federal agencies about how they're going to prioritize, select projects, and ultimately fund them, One thing's for certain, that as Bill mentioned, we will need a local match. And that's everything from our projects that are in queue to get funded to help just make repairs to our channel infrastructure, to allow us to do buyouts, as well as to allow us to do additional flood risk reduction projects long-term, whether that be with FEMA or the Corps. And right now, those local matches could vary anywhere from, on the low end, of 5% or 10%, and it could be as high as 35 or 40%. Again, we won't know all these details until the guidance gets worked out. But one thing we do know is that the legislation did not and could not specify select projects. Therefore, this money, for the most part, is made available on a first-come, first-served basis until expended. And so, therefore, timing is important about our ability to be able to stand up and provide a local match as these opportunities present themselves. And I can give you an example. On this court agenda on page 17, underneath the grant section, we're actually applying for, or asking court's permission to apply for, a grant to the tune of $165 million in FEMA money to help us do buyouts. Well, that grant, if it's awarded, is going to require around $66 million of flood control funds as a local match. Now, we're prepared to do that, but in the event that that grant application is awarded, we're fairly tapped out. And I want to encourage an open discussion about the need for a bond election, if for no other reason, so that we are best positioned to have local funding available so we can provide the local match as these opportunities make themselves available.
Unless other commissioners have, Commissioner Ellis?
In terms of timing, Russ, the options are, it may be for Mr. Sword.
Yeah, it is.
In terms of having an election, the option would be, I assume, to get sign off from the governor and do an election on a non-uniform election date. Tell me if I'm wrong, Mr. Sword. It's
No,
about,
that's correct.
and is there a cost if you do it on a non-uniform date?
Well, cost to the county, and I think the county clerk could speak to that better than I could.
So I know there are various options.
And then the
that
other
have been
thing
floated around.
we just need to keep in mind is for an election on a non-uniform date, you have to call the election at least 62 days before the election and no more than 90. So you have that 62-day to 90-day window. Now, for a uniform date in November, for example, it's 78 days to 90 days.
Okay, so if there were going to be an election, the soonest we could have an election would be July, right?
No, I think I can actually, I did some calculations. I'm showing you could actually hit June if that was your choice.
To do June, we'd have to vote today. Is my math right?
My notes indicate that you could do it on April 10th.
So if we did it April 10th, we could do, 4/10, we could do an election. At the next court meeting, April 10th, we could do an election when, in June?
I'm showing a June 16th date would be possible if we recall it by April 10th.
And
And then the other thing we have to always remember is the commissioners can call a special meeting, so you don't have to necessarily go by the regularly scheduled meeting dates.
so so we'd have to do a special meeting before June 10th, or at the latest do one on June, on 4/10, to have an election on June 16th.
Correct, and yeah, April 10th, I think, would be your last opportunity to hit the June 16th date.
But I'm told the cost is about $1 million to the county.
Again, I don't know. We have to ask the county clerk.
Mr. Tanner?
Just if you know, Mr. Stanton, or rough idea.
No, no. Mr. Tanner? On an election like this, how many polling places would there be?
Well, typically, it would be a countywide election, so we would be looking at our normal over 700 polling locations. I know the turnout would be small, but so it's, of course, early voting, our normal 46 early voting locations we demand. Probably most of our voting would happen during that time period.
For this one issue, but
Yeah, for this one issue, yes, sir.
could you change that?
We can look into it and we can consolidate to some degree, but there is, I think typically when it's a normal election, we would have the normal size, but we'll look into that, Judge. We'll have an answer.
If you were to consolidate,
Yes.
don't you have voting rights issues that would come up?
That's some of my concern is, start reducing, we could get into those type of issues.
Just, it's all a guess, Mr. Stanton, I know, but my concern is, I hear Russ saying we need the money, and I hear Mr. Jackson saying it right away. But have we ever had a summer election in Texas? I mean, with climate change, it's a little hotter.
Yes, I mean, we have had the runoff primary election in the summer, but in those typically they are consolidated quite significantly. So there are some challenges, us recruiting all the people to work in the summer, but hey, we do our very best. I mean, the June 16th is a date that can work for us because we're actually holding some smaller elections on that date.
The last runoff I remember, I think, was in Senator Cruz's race.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
When the federal courts had us move them, and it was a pretty low turnout. And obviously, if you won, you feel pretty good about it. But I was serving with the guy that lost, and he kind of thought it was a very low turnout.
Yes.
Obviously, what's the difference between a November election in terms of turnout, when more people get a chance to participate, as opposed to any time during the summer?
November is our highest turnout every 2 years, of course. And when there's a governor's election or a presidential election, that is always the highest turnout. Those are typical days when people expect to vote.
And to do it in June, I mean, obviously it's hot soon, and it was
Yes.
hot Memorial Day in that Cruz-Dewhurst race, and whoever was on the other side. But going into June, that's certainly, we're getting into a interesting territory. I assume would be, is your guess it would be one of the lowest turnouts in history?
I don't know if it'd be the lowest turnout in history. We've had some low turnout elections, but it's all about how much the media actually brings it to the attention of our voters, which drives turnout.
Okay. I was going to ask Mr. Jackson a few questions.
Go ahead.
Mr. Jackson, how quick could a bond issue be put together? I hear the concern about coming up with money, but how quick? I'm worried about having a summer election. And I worry about if there is one, and if it fails, will that be the political will to come back and do it again? Just my sense of the years I've been following politics is school bond issues, as an example. When one loses, it takes a lot of political courage to step back out there again. So my question is, I'm just trying to get a sense of how much damage, is it irreparable harm by waiting until a uniform election date when we know more people will show up? Arguably, it's just more democratic. I mean, they can always show up, but it's going to be different. It's going to be difficult and different trying to get them to show up.
That was
For some
Democratic
election.
with a little d, was it? With a little d, Democratic.
No, either way, to be honest with you, because you could go. I mean, it depends on if it looked like a partisan deal. By the way, you could get them coming out, and instead of voting on the issue, the merits of the issue, they may think that it was an attempt to pick a time when certain groups of people wouldn't show up. So that's my concern. But how quick could we get the money?
So basically on flood control, it's its own separate taxing unit. And we can't issue commercial paper without approval of the voters for permanent bonds. So it takes about 60 days to get commercial paper in order. We've already instructed our group to go ahead and take a look at that so that we get all our ducks in a row beforehand. But about 60 days is what it would take. Now, what you're trading off here is the opportunity, the need of the people right now versus waiting and these grants starting coming in. And we just don't have the matching funds for buying out homes. And John we already put $20 million up of our own money just to buy that, but the clock is ticking. And so that's the concern on it, is how far do you want to push it out on that. If they vote it down, again, we don't have an opportunity for the match because these are huge sums of money. On average, I ran the numbers yesterday. Let's say for every dollar that we put in, The federal government gives us $3. So let's just ramp that up to $1 billion. Well, we wouldn't spend $1 billion on day one. Russ's group, we would probably spend it over 10 years, or $100 million of our money over 10 years. The federal government's match would be about $300. So that's $400 million a year in projects. And the tax rate, basically, we would have to increase the tax rate on this because the county is not growing rapidly enough to pay for that. And the average home, single-family residence, the first year would see a $5 increase, and over 10 years, it would go to a total of $20.
That's for what size bond issue?
$1 billion.
For $1 billion.
Which then the federal government would be putting in a match, hypothetically, of $3 billion. That's $4 billion worth of projects. And so I think that's why we wanted to bring this early to you and all that, is because we don't want to lose out on this leverage of these matches with the federal government. And so, again, I'm not an expert on elections and who's going to show up and all that, but I just know that these are numbers that are real, and that this is a very small piece, really, when you look at what people lost and what insurance and all that goes. There's a component that actually the insurance companies may look at some of these things, and we start doing things that may help them on their own insurance on this. So there's an offset potentially. So again, the timing, that's for the court to make up. The dollar amounts, though, this is when we met yesterday on it, we would go from about $5 on the average house up to the $20. And then somebody who is over 65 that lives in the average house wouldn't pay anything.
I've heard various numbers from $1 billion bond package to $2 billion. I think I saw in the paper there were rumors of higher numbers. Might have been a rumor 10. I'd like to get a sense of if it is $1 billion or less, 900 million was one figure I heard. Mr. Poppy might be the one to answer this. I saw $2 billion in the paper at least. If it was $1 billion as opposed to $2 billion, I want you to walk through that cost-benefit ratio scenario based on the federal money coming in, and give me a sense of what gets included with $1 billion and what gets left out. What would be included in terms of projects if it was $2 billion or more, and what can be done with the $1 billion?
Well, we might need a little more time to answer that question specifically, but you're right, though. Many of these federal programs do have a benefit to cost ratio requirement. For example, the grant that we're pursuing to do the home buyouts on this agenda requires a benefit to cost ratio above 1. And that's not my requirements, those are from the feds. And so we have to be looking at projects that would qualify and meet the federal statutes and be eligible for that funding. We've got a long list of projects we'd like to do at the district. We don't always use benefit to cost in selecting our projects. We typically like to look at, well, how many homes would benefit from us doing a project. But again, if we're looking at using local dollars to leverage federal dollars, then I'm sort of stuck with dealing with whatever parameters that the feds would put on us. So what we would do is we'd be looking at our list of projects that we'd like to do over the next 3-4 years, just as part of our normal capital program, and then try to do some additional evaluation on those to see, well, which ones, if we were to complete them, would meet the federal requirements for funding, and those are the ones that we would push forward and try to take advantage of.
Cost benefit, you walked me through this when I first came in, first time we met, and it took me a while to catch it. But if I caught it, it sounds like cost benefit ratio means it's difficult to include equity in the equation, so that if it's a poor neighborhood, regardless if there are more people there, with the federal, not your guidelines, but in the federal guidelines, is that a fair assessment?
That is correct, but there's also different federal pots of money that are being made available, and one of the pots of money that we'd be looking at and working with community services is CDBG, or Community Development Block Grant funding, and that comes from HUD, and that's funding that is almost required to be spent, 70% of that in most cases, to be spent in low to moderate income areas. That money is also available to do things such as future flood risk reduction projects. So we could work with CSD to identify pots of money coming from CDBG funding so we could then accelerate projects in those areas that wouldn't necessarily qualify for a different pot of federal money that does require a benefit to cost evaluation.
And you know there's legislation afoot trying to move to wipe out that.
I'm on the periphery, I'm aware of that.
Yeah,
yes.
I don't know if it'll happen, but how does that benefit some of our precincts here when we take the county money and use it in unincorporated areas, CDBG money, and it's only the city's money that would be used inside the city limits, unless you make an exception, somehow you tie it to a benefit to people outside.
Getting a little bit on my lane, I might have to call Daphne or somebody from CSD to answer that better. But I do know the city and the county work together about those disbursements, and how those formulas are generated, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah. If it's $1 billion, Ms. Poppy, would Hall and Greens be included or not? Do they meet the cost-benefit ratio?
I mean, I think the short answer is absolutely. We'd be looking for projects that we could carve out in those watersheds and then push forward for these various programs as they start becoming available. Again, some will require benefit to cost, but others, like I mentioned, CDBG, would not. So we'd be looking across the board in order to maximize our ability to bring projects to as much of the county as we could.
Judge, I'm just of the opinion it's always difficult to ask people for money. They usually don't get happy with whatever it is. But my preference would be if we were going to do it, I was very excited when I called you in to brief me if the figure was $2 billion, because it looked like if there's an election, we'd be able to go out and say it was an equal opportunity storm event in neighborhoods that historically feel as though they didn't have the political muscle, we're going to be included. But if it comes down, and not just my precinct, others as well, all of us have some of those areas now. But
I
if it's
have all
$1
those
billion,
areas.
yeah, no. But if it's $1 billion or less than that, my fear is a lot of those areas are not going to be covered.
Well, again, I think the issue that we wanted to raise today was we need the ability, and we're advising that we need to have the ability to have local funds available to do a federal match. Now, there could be additional funding made available through something above and beyond $1 billion, if that's what we'd like to do. And that could be to fund projects without the assistance of a federal program. And then we would have much more say over how we would use that money and prioritize those projects.
And if it was larger, Mr. Jackson, if we didn't need it, we don't have to issue it, right? You're getting permission to do it. So it's not as though it's a blank check, because if you can't justify it, you don't need it, don't do it, including $1 billion. So if it was $2 billion, if you don't need it, you don't issue the whole $2 billion at one time.
That's correct, because we don't know the pace at which the federal dollars will ultimately start to flow. And so you're right. I think whatever bond election is held, whatever that dollar amount is, we would not sell all that on day one. I would be working very closely with Mr. Jackson's office to figure out these federal opportunities as they become available and only draw down the funds as we would need them.
I'm asking more questions, you had a thought.
It appears to me that although we have not articulated it this way, that we are really talking about two bond elections, as there were. That we have the first bond, that we have haste that we need to do. Because if we do not find a way to match the federal dollars, they will go somewhere else to those who have the ability to match the federal dollars. And so if we delay on at least a targeted bond election so that we can have the adequate match to tap into the programs, if we don't use it, we lose it. And then there is this secondary bond that we have in our mind of the greater, more long-term projects that we may not necessarily fit within what is going to be available with the federal matches, sort of a catch-all bond that we may come back to the voters later on at leisure after we know what we've been able to gather, what we've been able to repair, what we've been able to fix, and then go back to the voters to say this is what's left over, and to be able to target with them at that time. So there's a need for speed on the matching, but there's not necessarily a need for speed on the global planning that comes on. And so the question, in a way, is if we're going to go for the federal matching, so that we take that 5% or that 20%, that 25% match, and we use that then to leverage to get those dollars. Is that $4 billion, if we're pursuing the $4 billion matching funds to bring them for our infrastructure in this region, is that going to be worth the potential $1 million that we have to come up to have a special election so that we don't lose the opportunity for the $4 billion? And that, I think, is part of the question that we have before us today as policymakers. Am I framing this correctly?
I don't think I could said it much better.
I think as policymakers, we also have before us a political reality. And that is, after the most horrific and historic storm event we've had, I've heard members of this body say it's an opportunity to do something big. And we may not get another bite at that apple. And my fear is if we play small ball and then we go back to the voters at some later point, and I mean, I'm sincere, just based on my experience of having helped with a lot of school bond elections, sometimes against friends. You know, if people don't have a sense that you're impacting them and you come back later, that second bite, they may not have the appetite to go for it. So that's my concern, and it's a sincere concern.
And Commissioner Ellis, my fear is that I might actually agree with you.
Welcome home, Jack.
No, in all seriousness, we can't afford to lose a bond election and then go back in 3 months and ask for another one. We've got to get it right the first time. And if that takes a little more deliberation, then I think we may need to do that. Russ, I mean, are you prepared in June to be able to put together a plan to tell each and every voter that's going to vote for this what they're going to get and when they're going to get it?
It would be a tall order, Commissioner. You're right.
No doubt. Okay. Well, that's my 2 cents.
So,
Judge, I'd like to say that in my little over 29 years around here, I have never seen this Commissioner's Court ever once engage in a concern about political clout, whether any areas would get something. When I first arrived here, the majority of the members of the court were Democrats, and they were great Democrats. And we worked extremely well together. And to me, it's absurd, even remotely, for anyone to say that this Commissioner's Court is going to look up and say that area is poor and we're not going to do anything for them. That has never been the case. I don't think it ever will be the case. And so I want to make that very, very clear, that every single one of us has responsibility, and equal responsibility to everyone who lives in this county. Having said that, you know, it's hard for the county at times to work with the city as the city increases density with poor floodplain management. The big day is coming inside the city of Houston when the flooding will overwhelm people because they continue to increase density without even beginning to do adequate detention. Mr. Blunt, would you agree with that?
Yes, sir. I can tell you, though, they are working on that. I think they are approving their new ordinance, which is very similar to ours, shortly if they haven't done it, and they are working on detention. We are working with them. I think they realize the issue. They have a very difficult issue compared to us because they're working with infrastructure, in some cases 100 years old, whereas ours typically has been designed with engineering standards, although maybe 1960s engineering standards as opposed to 1905 engineering standards. But yes, their infrastructure is in very bad shape. They acknowledge that. I think they said over 98% of their infrastructure isn't up to what we consider acceptable standards.
Thank you. Now, what's interesting to me, you got these good people from Jersey Village here, and many other good people here, but a lot of Jersey Village came to express their opinion. I appreciate that greatly. The irony of that is that even as late as this morning, there was an attack on the county judge about, the county and the way we spend money, particularly, that we should engage in tax caps and all that, and even recommended by a senator, your senator, state senator, people from Jersey Village, and I might add, unfortunately, mine as well, to say the county needs to cut taxes. Right now, we need to cut taxes. Y'all might want to ask Senator Bettencourt, how in the world are we going to help each other if we're out worried about his perceived outlandish, as far as I'm concerned, thoughts that the county is out here trying to waste money? Or we have so much money we can fix all the problems, which we estimate the flood control problem be at least a fix of $35 billion rough. Also, I think it's important to note that, once again, the state of Texas, Jersey Village is part of the state of Texas, part of Harris County, but the reality is, when it comes to sales tax, the state of Texas extracts from Harris County over $5.5 billion a year. Is that true, Mr. Auditor?
Right.
$5.5 billion. And here we're worried about trying to have a bond election for $1 billion, when if they would just consider giving us 20% of what they're going to collect this year, we'd be on our way. And they're always talking about some people at the state level, saying, oh, ad valorem taxes are out of control. Not true. Not here. And I'm to a point now that the state of Texas is AWOL when it comes to helping Harris County. Mr. Turkel, that $5 billion they're talking about, somebody's recently said, $5 billion coming from Congress. Is it true that 78% of that $5 billion is intended for low-income housing?
Yes.
78% to low-income housing. Nothing to do with flooding, correct? Okay, so these are all these sound bites that we hear. And so what we need to do is to get together and say to the state of Texas, who has going on $11 billion in their rainy day fund, give us 20% of the sales tax you're going to collect in Harris County every year for about 5 years, and watch what we can do. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
I got a few more questions.
Okay, because I have a few too. Go ahead.
You go?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Mr. Jackson, when there's a requirement for a local match, does the federal government require us to show them the money right away, or do we make a commitment?
We have to encumber those.
I can answer that first. Go ahead. It depends, but typically, when they approve the project, they'll give you their portion. So you need your portion to complete the project. For buyouts, when you go to a closing, they expect you to pay your 25% of the house in order to buy.
So if it's $1 billion package, has anybody run the numbers on how much right now money would be required? I'm assuming there's some thought into trying to figure out why now and not in November. So if somebody run the numbers on how much money we're talking about, and in line with what my colleague was making reference to, second question, was there any thought to asking the state with $12 billion to short us the money as a loan until we could do the bond issue? And I'm going through these scenarios sincerely because I think a summer election is going to be a real challenge to get it passed. Certainly not a partisan comment, but at least the polling data that I've looked at is usually the little D's that'll vote for it. Since that question was raised earlier, and I'm just worried about passing it in June, July, or August.
I'll have to go with the engineer and flood control to see timing of events. Also, we're trying to figure out when the money would be forthcoming from the federal government, and so we can take a look at that and then get back with you.
Mr. Poppy, again on this cost-benefit ratio issue, regardless of what the county wants to do, how would we get around what has been in the law, I'm told from an executive opinion in the 80s, that created this, what has dwarfed it at this cost-benefit ratio? So regardless of what the intentions are, how could we do, in particular, I can think of some others, but clearly Green and Halls, how do you get to those, regardless of what we want to do with federal money? Would we have to use our money to do those two?
It might come to that, Commissioner, but as we talked about previously, we've got some big detention basins in construction right now in the Greens Bayou watershed. They're actually being built with some federal funds that require a benefit to cost evaluation. So we were able to structure a project together such that we were able to use federal funding and still meet their requirements for benefit to cost. So I'm confident those projects exist. Sometimes we just have to get a little creative to put them together.
Yeah. For Mr. Sword, if there is an election, can language be structured on the ballot if there's a fear of what the voters will or will not support? Could you give them an option of the $1 billion and the $2 billion?
I'd have to talk to our bond person, but I think the answer would be no. It's got to be a yes or no type vote. I don't even know how you could structure an election that would have an option in it.
That'd be a referendum. You can't do that. Judge, I'd like to clarify something, by the way. Betancourt is one of the senators. I fortunately don't live in his district. He's one of the senators that is in my precinct, and his area, as you folks know, and many others, and all over Congressional 7 was one of the hardest hit. Senatorial 7, one of the hardest hit areas when it comes to incredible flooding, because that's where the release, the bulk of the release, had a major effect.
If an item is on the agenda to vote on an amount, when we meet again in 2 weeks or sooner, what all would be required? You have to show what the tax rate is, what it'll cost. Do we have the option of some level of specificity? So if we're going to ask the voters for $1 billion, is it kind of trust me? Or do we lay out in general terms what we are going to do?
Doug, I'll ask Doug Graves, our expert on bond elections, to explain. But typically, I mean, there's a balancing act. You have to be precise in what your ballot language is. But if you are too precise, you're not able to spend the money on what you would like to spend it on, or you have no flexibility then.
So what I'm going to is, at least I know when the city does what they call a CIP, you know, they got parks, whatever, and you have some idea. And I'm told when the county has voted on bond issues before, there has been some separate language that may not be controlling, but it's a guidepost to give people some idea of what they'll get if they make the investment.
And the county has done that, as you say, with a separate Commissioners Court resolution, a separate court order. It comes down to the precise language in the order.
So it's not binding, but it is prescriptive or instructive.
Correct. It's a statement of intent, I suppose, would be a way to state it.
Commissioners,
Go ahead,
my name is
Doug.
Douglas Ray. I'm with the Harris County Attorney's Office. Specifically, we can make the bond proposition very specific, or we can make it very general, as long as it falls within the powers granted to the entity that is conducting the bond election. The Flood Control District has wide discretion as long as it has to do with flood control issues. You can make it as specific as saying so many $1 million for the Greens Bayou, redevelopment project, and you would then be able to issue the bonds and spend it on that project only. You could ask for money to spend on flood control generally, in which case you could issue the bonds and spend the money on anything that would qualify as a flood control project. So there, you have a wide range of discretion, but what you have to be careful about is if you vote for a specific project, that you'll have to spend it on that specific project. And the specific example I always point to is when Metro had a bond issue to authorize bonds for the West Park corridor, and then they came back and wanted to put the train on Richmond Avenue rather than West Park Avenue. And there's been a lot of litigation over whether they actually were authorized to do that or not. So you have to be very careful if you want to make it more specific a proposition than a more general proposition. And the other thing, and this is what I actually snuck into the room to tell Mr. Sword over his shoulder, is if you have a bond election on a proposition and it fails, you cannot come back to the electorate for 2 years after that with the same proposition. If you have a specific proposition and it fails, then you can't propose that same specific proposition. If you have a general proposition, then you can't propose the general proposition.
You can.
You cannot.
So if it's, you cannot, whether it's specific or general.
Not for 2 years. So that's the kind of thing. A lot of people have, raised that issue with us as far as the Astrodome funding was concerned. More than 2 years have gone by since then. If we would go back to the electorate, we could ask for any style of project, but there was a 2-year period of time where we could not.
We're not doing a bond there.
I'm just saying that there was a period of time where we could not go back to the electorate. That period of time has passed, but that West Park corridor thing is that's the example I always point to. The Metro has authority to have sell bonds for the West Park corridor, but they because of the litigation, basically time has passed and their costs have increased to such an extent that they can no longer afford to build the project even if they could issue the bonds. So that's the kind of thing that you have to keep in mind.
Indirectly, I think you answered something I was asking earlier. If it fails, let's say it's on the ballot in June. If it fails, if it's general language, you got to wait 2 years to come back with general language. Could you come back sooner with specific language? Or you can't come back at all?
Yeah, as long as it's not the same proposition that you proposed before. You're asking whether or not a specific flood control project could be passed if a general request for flood control fails. I don't know the specific answer to that, but I'm sure there are people who would challenge that. Whatever we try to issue a bond, we have to go to the Attorney General's office to get approval, and one of the first things they do is they go and look for the statute or vote that you had that you are pointed to that gives you the power to issue those bonds. And if it's a bond election, they're going to go look at the language of that bond election and determine whether the purpose for which you're proposing to issue the bonds fit within the description of what it is that you voted for.
All of this could be academic if the governor didn't agree to let something go on the ballot in a non-regular or uniform voting date. Do we have some sense, Judge, or anyone, whether or not the governor is amenable, and are there conditions on how high he let it go?
To my knowledge, no governor has ever really denied a local bond election, but there haven't been that many that called for a special date. I would think it would be very difficult, but this is a good point to jump in. The reason we're having this discussion, some of you are out there going, why are they talking about this? Because we have to talk about it in open court. We can't sit around and talk about, well, when are we going to put a bond election on? What's going to be on it? We can't have that discussion anywhere but here in open court. So this has actually been very useful because there are a lot of dilemmas facing us here. When do you have the election? How much is it? Do you get specific? Do you leave it general? Those are all questions. And from my point of view, it was not a flippant comment, I represent the whole county. So anything I'm looking at has to look at all the watersheds. And I go back and during Harvey, it was noted that Sims watershed, Mr. Poppy, suffered no flooding at all. Is that correct?
Close. I think we completed the federal project in 2015, and we got a lot of comments of praise about completing that project that lessened the flooding along the channel. I think there were still some subdivisions and some tributaries that had issues, and those are on our radar screen to address in a future project.
Okay. So whether we're talking about Sims or Greens or Falls, and the way the county has grown, there are now areas out off 1960 that are low-income areas. And so, to me, I think the professionals need to look at where do we get the most bang for our buck. And Commissioner, you and I have agreed on this, and I said it, I think, even before you were here. This cost-benefit analysis doesn't make any sense. We ought to be looking at how many people we benefit, not the cost of the homes that they're in. So we need to find a way to work that, and the CDBG funds might be that case. But Mr. Jackson, we cannot ignore the fact our only funding source for this is the property tax.
It's the property tax, but as this discussion went on, the state received a lot of sales tax money from all the people rebuilding and all that. And it would be, maybe we could ask them to give us that money to be able to start our match, to give us some time.
So when we talk about Senator Betancourt, who, as was pointed out this morning, said we ought to lower our tax rate by a penny. Where do we cut? Can't do criminal justice. I mean, we don't get to pick our customers there. Indigent health care, I've been up to Austin time after time pleading for the state to come in and help pick up some of that cost, and that's 27% of basically the county taxpayers' payment to the county. So I would hope that if we do a Harris County Flood Control District bond, whenever we do it, whatever the amount, however specific, that some of these elected officials who have been so short-sighted will have a little bit longer vision. And if they don't, I'm going to be real blunt. I hope the voters understand, exactly who it is that's preventing flood control efforts from going forward. It ain't going to be this body. It's going to be people like Senator Betancourt. And sorry, but we got to start naming names, and I'll leave off the second part of that. So that's why this discussion is going on, and I think now that we've had it publicly, unless the commissioners object, I would like to encourage Mr. Poppe, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Sword, get together, come to us with a recommendation, and then ultimately 5 people here get to vote on it. And I think that's the best way to go forward. Do you agree with that, Commissioner?
Yeah.
Now, we can always change it.
I want to make sure I asked earlier about what has to be in the language, because if next week, if we have a special meeting, or if it's in 2 weeks and it comes up, and if there is an appetite to go above 100 million or 500 million, or if the figure is 1 billion, and if somebody, one of the commissioners wanted to say, hey, I want to try it. I think I got one shot. I want to do the 2 billion. I want to make sure I know what's required. I don't want somebody to say, well, you don't know the tax rate, you don't want to know this. So I want to make sure each of us, not just me, each of us are given the ability to have our very capable staff give us those numbers, whatever it takes, so we have the option. And then let the chips fall where they may. At the end of the day, Judge and colleagues, I'm old school in my politics. You ask for what you want and take as much of it as you can get. And then you roll with it. I hope to be supportive of whatever it is. But I do feel very strongly we ought to go big, because I don't think we're going to get a second bite.
I have a follow-up question for Doug Ray, based upon what you said, Commissioner. Is it possible for us, if we look at the overall plans that we have, the $35 billion to do everything someday, with
35, usually 35.
$35 billion, if I understand that, if we did everything that needs to be done, that is a $35 billion project. And so we're talking about nipping at the edges here and trying to get the federal funding that we can as soon as we can effectively do that. But here's a question. Can we, in our bond, have with a proposition that says we want $1 billion to be issued immediately, to be matched however we can, and then to request on the bond that over a period of 10 years, because our flood control, if they worked as diligently as they couldn't get these projects done if it was all approved at one time, but say in year 2 to have a second bond issue saying in year 2 an additional $1 billion, year 3 another $1 billion, year 4 another $1 billion. In other words, can we go out into the future and ask the voters to vote, do you want $1 billion now, and then for subsequent years going out to 10 years, in essence, approve up to $10 billion, but with the voters voting on how far out they're willing to do an issue? Is that something that we can do?
Well, that's a novel question. I don't know really the answer to it. I know that if what we ordinarily do, for example, the last time we did a road bond, the $700 million amount was premised on a project lifetime of 10 years. So it was never our intent to issue $700 million worth of bonds the first day. Those were going to be issued as needed over that 10-year period of time. And I presume that the plan that you have, in effect, is exactly the way that they would do it. They would get the authorization, and then they would actually only issue the debt on those dates that they actually needed as the years go by. So what you're asking is, can we explicitly require them to do that in the language of the bond? And I don't know the answer to that.
There might be some taxpayers who are very comfortable with $1 billion today, but they don't want to vote for more than that later on. But by stacking that opportunity, we may be able to see what is the will of the public in terms of larger amounts to a later date. And we may not want to do that because we may do some polling data and decide that that would be detrimental to the initial bond that we want to do. But as the judge so eloquently pointed out, this is the place that we get to ask these questions because we don't get to talk to each other when we're not in open session.
Judge, I just have,
And that's where your experience will kick in.
I don't know about that. Anyway, what we've been using the word term penny for some of the people not here. A penny in ad valorem tax for Harris County. What's that?
$44 million.
Huh?
$44 million.
So we talk about a penny. We're talking about $44 million. That's
correct.
what.
And for the average homeowner, that's what?
$44 million. So that's what the senator's talking about, us cutting taxes at the time we need money. $44 million. Judge, I think it's important to note that I'm not going to include Sims in this and some of the areas around Lake Houston, but for the most part, I think it's important that people note that the majority of the water coming into Harris County is coming through Precinct 3 and Precinct 4. It's coming from the surrounding counties. And so the reality is what we do in Precincts 3 and 4 are going to have a huge impact as that water heads towards Houston, Jersey Village, downtown Houston, and things like that. So, I mean, and I believe if we are going to consider having this, and maybe calling this meeting, special meeting of Commissioners Court to come up with a figure, we need to give as much time as we can to flood control, to Russ Poppe, to go ahead and put together as best you can at a very quick pace the information that we need. So I think we need to do it. Gather as much information as we can before we have that meeting.
Dean, in line with what you just said, says, I guess we must have been violating open meetings in Austin because I could lean over and whisper something to you. I guess the legislature exempted themselves before you and I were there, right? They did that before you were there as well. I'm going to lay out this.
Senate's a different place from where
Yeah,
I was.
I'm, particularly now that I'm gone, by the way. I want to lay out this option.
Is it better or worse?
When we're trying to get a bill passed, I'm going to tell them it's better. If I'm not trying to get a bill passed, I'll tell the truth. But look, in line with that, just in case somebody wants to lay out this option, I'm going to ask right now, since I can't do it privately. I'm told that if it's $900 million, that's about $150 a year. Is that right?
$150.
It's about 2.5 cents per 100 square foot property tax increase.
No.
Okay, I'm told that 2.5 billion would cover all of the local match requirements for existing federal projects plus flood control CIP projects, including bayou projects not currently planned and underway.
I don't know. That's a question for Russ.
No, right now, if we're only talking about the local match, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. But if you start talking about a $2.5 billion election, I think that would fund beyond what I think we could foreseeably see right now as far as needing for a local match. So then you would be talking about potentially monies that would be available to just fund flood control projects that may not otherwise be eligible for federal.
And if we don't need it, don't issue the bonds.
That's correct.
So I'm just going to ask, because whether or not I would make the motion, I can't ask if there'd be a second. We'll know until we do it. I would like the information prepared for me or anybody else in case they decide to try to go big. One room I heard was 3.1 billion, which was going to include $600 million to move existing flood control project debt off of the Harris County books. I'm not even going to go there. But at least when there were rumors going around, since I can't talk to my distinguished colleagues and get advice from them, or I'd go to jail for it. I'm sure none of them would turn me in.
You can talk to one of us.
Yeah.
As long as they don't talk to anybody
As long as they don't talk to anybody else. And if they did, would they tell me before they tell the DA? They say he knew it. But I want to prepare, I'd like that prepared with whatever's needed. You got to show the tax rate and whether or not I'll offer it or not. But I want that option.
I would say
You don't need a motion, just go ahead and.
Well, I'm just making a request now, in line with what you said, Dean, so you know that at least that's on the radar.
Okay, here's where we are. You got 5 members of court.
Mr. Christie, Councilmember Christie.
Well, we want to
God
thank
bless
you for
the
being
city of
here.
Houston. Thanks for being here.
Can y'all give us some money? Any?
Y'all are taking a good leadership role seriously. We need to stay best friends. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Back to my earlier request that the county attorney, Mr. Jackson, engineer, flood control, y'all get your heads together. And in that period, any member of this court is free to contact y'all and ask you to develop any material you want.
Absolutely.
So, and that's what occurs on a regular basis. So have at it and come back to us as quickly as you can, because we've got to make a decision. We've got to move forward on this.
I will say, managing expectations up front, the more quickly you want my office to respond, unfortunately, the more vague it's going to be, just because we don't know clarity yet about how the federal projects are getting funded and which ones will be eligible. So just
Was
saying
I clear
that up
enough? I'll put it in writing. But
No, he's talking about federal projects.
Yeah.
front. Yeah. I mean, we're going to have to make some presumptions.
And let me use this opportunity before we get back to the agenda. I'm looking at Ms. Lamel and Mr. Turkel, and I know Jack Peterson and our Office of Legislative Relations, Donna Warndorf and everybody. Following Harvey, they've done a remarkable job of coordinating the effort. And Harvey was different than Ike, but having that team work with your team, Russ,
Very helpful.
we have such better information now than we had following Ike, and I think we're in a much better position to pull down those funds because of the work that everybody did. So I just want to get that compliment out there before you come to us with a recommendation. We all start throwing things at you.
Judge, one last thing. Mr. Poppy, just before you go, I want to clear up something my colleague here said. He said that most of the water comes in to Harris County through precincts 3 and 4. Please be mindful that it all flows through precinct 2.
That's at the end. That's at the end.
But it can't be forgotten.
That's right. Thank
All
you.
right.
I'll take any questions.
No. Let me go back, by the way, to county engineer on page 2 at the bottom, item F1. It should say NRG rather than Reliant.
what page is that?
Page 2, at the bottom. I believe it should say NRG rather than Reliant.
Yes, sir, this was an old contract.
Okay, all right, good. Okay, total budget management, legislative relations, central technology services, public health services, Pollution Control Services. Community Services. Page 9, item 9B, replace the word annual with Hurricane Ike Round 2. So it would now read amendments to the Hurricane Ike Round 2 Action Plan. Now, it's worth noting, since we're talking about money, we're still getting money from Hurricane Ike. And that's 10 years ago, almost. So when we talk about federal dollars and flowing, and yeah, not so quick all the time. County Library, Youth and Family Services, Constables, Sheriff, Fire Marshal, Institute of Forensic Sciences, County Clerk, District Clerk, County Attorney.
Quick question.
Yep.
On the Brown case, is that outside attorneys or what is that? 25,000?
I'm sorry.
That Alfred Brown case?
No, it would not be. You're talking about on our matrix. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it must have come out when you did the staff briefing.
No, it would not be outside attorneys. It's probably just normal expenses.
And that's the case where the DA did file a complaint against that former county attorney.
I read the DA
City
intended
attorney.
to file a complaint.
Assistant DA. So is anybody looking at, are you all looking at other similar cases that'll come up from that prosecutor? The issue is whether or not evidence was...
Well, we're not, but we know the district attorney is, and we are working with the district attorney on all those cases. That's pretty bad.
Okay.
Okay. Community Supervision and Correction, District Courts, Travel and Training.
Travel and training, page 15, item number 26, Mr. Jackson. They're asking for a $19,000 blanket, okay? I'm gonna move that be changed to $1,900. And then when that be reviewed, and then instead of just giving a blanket, all right?
Okay.
Also, Mr. Sword, would you put together, as far as energy defense, about how that department is structured as far
Yes,
as...
sir. We will do that, and we'll provide a report.
Thank you.
Does it need a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, while we're on travel and training, Commissioner Ellis,
Yes.
you're out of state. You show 49 people and a blanket, $25,000. Where are they going? And the reason I ask is you've got an asterisk, and that means that they're traveling by county vehicle.
Oh, no, they won't be going by county vehicle.
I didn't think so.
Yeah, you know, I'm on the board of NACO.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Of course, yours doesn't have to be on
Yeah,
here.
but I'd like to take a staff, there won't be 49 of them. I just threw up a number, because that was covered in-state and out-state, but no, they won't be driving. If so, I don't think they'll go but one time.
I just wanted to pick on you a little bit about that. If you made your staff drive to Washington DC and stuff. All right. I show on page 16, item 30 is withdrawn. Oh, and on page 15, item 15 is withdrawn. Grants, fiscal services and purchasing.
Mr. Auditor, there, on that Memorial Herman,
Yes, sir.
y'all looked at that?
We've started looking at it, yes, sir.
Are y'all gonna make some type of arrangement, to pay them partial, in a payment that you say you have to pay by the 31st, I think?
I think that's what the contract says.
I mean, but if he's not satisfied,
Which item are you talking about, Commissioner?
talking about page 18, number 2, under bottom of the page.
Okay.
Well, and Commissioner, that is in relationship to a settlement that comes from the 1990s. So every year we have to make a payment to Memorial Herman. We know the auditor is looking at that. We know budget management and risk management have also reviewed all of that. Certainly, if there is a payment made to Memorial Herman that is not a proper payment, we can take action to recover that payment.
Okay, so we can approve this subject to y'all making a payment, and if you think it's too high or find it's too high, that they understand we're going to want a refund,
We can do that, yes, sir.
okay?
We can certainly explain
Because
that
I don't
to
want
the hospital.
to lose that contract,
Yes, sir.
because that was quite a deal many years ago.
Correct.
Okay.
And I would say that that number has been coming down each year that we've been paying. We've been working with the sheriff very closely
I know.
on who's getting delivered there. So,
But this, under this agreement, Memorial Herman is supposed to be charging us at their cost,
that's correct.
which is a lot different than what they bill.
That's correct. They eat the first $1 million.
Huh? First million.
First million, and then they bill us for above that at their cost.
So does that make them the provider of choice?
No, what this is this is when somebody is in our jail and has to be taken to an emergency room, they're taken there. And we're working on that because Ben Taub is right next to it, and we should be taking them there, which...
They used to like, bear in mind, they don't have to be in the custody of the sheriff of Harris County. They could be in the custody of Pasadena PD, but that's in Harris County, and it's just basically, Mr. Sword somewhat still falls under the responsibility of the sheriff somehow.
Once they've been arrested, that's where the challenge is. It's not necessary that they be in the
Yeah.
jail, they just have to be in custody.
Yeah, that's pretty complicated. What they were doing for years, they were getting the lifelines. And they were taking people that had been shot, suspects or whatever, taking them to Landon and Memorial Herman, and we asked, hey, just put them on the gurney, go 100 feet or 150 feet, put them in Ben Taub, they wouldn't do it. So then they sued us for several $1 million. But we came out okay.
We're okay now.
All right, thank you. That's under the mighty Michael Fleming, county attorney.
Gets us to Commissioners Court, County Judge, motion. Commissioner 1, I show that you're withdrawing one of your items.
Yeah. Motion on the other one.
Okay. Commissioner 2 has no items. Commissioner 3, Commissioner 4,
Motion.
miscellaneous. Emergency supplemental items. We have one supplemental item. Could we have a motion on the entire agenda except for public hearings and executive session?
Motion.
Second.
All in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Very good.
Judge, I'm aye on everything. I abstain on pages 24 through 25, items 14A through 14P like Paul.
And Judge, I'm out on everything other than the O'Donnell fees, what we know on that part. Yeah. Well, the part that's not related to the bail lawsuits, okay, that's separate, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
You can divide the two. So just on the bail lawsuit, on the other one, that's just for some of the legal work, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Just on the bail part, not the other part.
So we have two public hearings. We have recommendation by the Office of the County Engineer for a public hearing to approve revisions to subdivision plats in Precinct 2 for David Ryland Homes on Dreamland. Is anyone here this morning wishing to speak for, against, or on this item? Move to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the second public hearing is a recommendation by the Office of the County Engineer for a public hearing to approve revisions to subdivision plats in Precinct 2 for St. Charles Place, Section 2. Is anyone here this morning wishing to speak for, or against, or on this item? Seeing none?
Second.
All in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Very good.